Hi, my name is Rosa. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Sustainable Employment in Azim Premji University. In this video, I'm going to be sharing some specific findings from the State of Working India 2021 report. In particular, I'm going to be talking about what has been the gendered implications of the pandemic on the Indian labor market. The impact of the pandemic on the labor market can broadly be classified into two. On the one hand, there is the impact as a result of the lockdown, which was announced in late March, and it completely stopped all economic activities and put into place very strict mobility restrictions. Even after the lockdown was relaxed and most states went on as business as usual, there was also another impact that continued, which was because of the overall economic contraction that occurred, which may have affected certain industries and certain kinds of workers specifically. In this video, I'm going to be talking about both of these impacts. To begin with, let's look at what has been the impact of the national lockdown, which was announced in the end of March, on the Indian labor market and how this impact was different for men and women. For this, we essentially use the CMI's Consumer Pyramid Household Survey, which is a panel survey of individuals over a sustained period of time. We construct a panel using this database, beginning with those who were workers in December 2019, that is, they were employed pre-pandemic, and then we look at what happened to these workers in the month of April 2020, which is the lockdown month. And then we also look at what happened to these same workers in the month of December 2020, about 7 months after the lockdown. So through this, we are able to identify 4 pathways of employment for any kind of worker. So in this table, you will see the 4 possible pathways of employment. First, you see the no recovery trajectory, which is essentially individuals who lost employment during the lockdown and then were not able to come back into work even after the lockdown 7 months later. Then you see the delayed job loss trajectory, which is essentially individuals who may not have lost work during the lockdown, but then went on to lose work by the end of the year in December 2020. Third, we have the recovery trajectory, which are those individuals who may have lost work during the lockdown, but then were able to come back into employment by the end of the year. And finally, you have the no effect trajectory, which is basically those individuals who continue to remain employed during the lockdown as well as towards the end of the year in December 2020. Now, how did these pathways or trajectories manifest for men and women? And here we see some very stark differences in the labor market experiences for men and women. So I want you to look at this figure, which compares the labor market trajectories for men and women. The yellow part of the figure represents the no effect trajectory, which is basically individuals who are unaffected by job loss. And as you can see, 60.6% of men did not face any job loss during the lockdown and they were able to hold on to their employment even after the lockdown. The corresponding figure for women, on the other hand, is only 18.7%. A similar stark contrast we see when we look at the no recovery trajectory. We see that about 7% of the December male workforce lost jobs during the lockdown and they continue to remain out of the labor market even after 7 months. For women, on the other hand, the number is 46.6%, which is to say that nearly half of the female workforce were now out of the workforce by the end of the year. They lost their jobs during the lockdown and they were unable to come back into work. So clearly, what we find is that because of the economic lockdown, you have a huge employment impact, and this employment impact disproportionately affected the women who were pushed out of the labor market during the lockdown and were not able to come back into work even 7 months after. So the question that then arises is that was this exodus of women that we see unique to certain kinds of women, that is, women in certain kinds of employment? And for this, we basically looked at what is the sort of transitions across different kinds of employment for women and compared it with similar transitions for men. So if you look in your screen, you see a wave graph. Now this wave graph is basically looking on your left hand side, you have 2019. So these are those who were in the workforce in the last 3 months of 2019. And we followed them and looked at their transitions over the course of 1 year in the last 3 months of 2020. So on the left hand side, you see these labels. So DW represents daily wage work, SE stands for self-employment, TS stands for temporary salaried, and PS is for permanent salaried. On the right hand side, you see the similar categories, except that you have an additional group which is OW, which is essentially your out of workforce. So what is this wave graph telling us? The first thing that you can see is if you look at just the out of workforce label on the right hand side. So on the one hand, out of workforce for men, which is the top panel, comprised only 11%. So only 11% of the 2019 workforce were now out of the workforce. But for women, the corresponding number is 48%. So half of the female workforce were now out of the workforce, something resonating with what we see in the trajectory analysis earlier. But the other thing that you see is that this exit from the workforce is something that is seen across all employment categories for women. So let's look at the self-employed category, and first let's look at what's happening for men. So you have the self-employed, a small narrow stream going into out of work, the yellow panel going into out of work. This essentially accounts for about 9% of the male self-employed workforce. On the other hand, you look at the similar line for women. It's nearly half, about 44% of self-employed women were now out of workforce. And you see a similar case in the case of permanent salaried. We see that only about 8% of permanent salaried men had moved into out of workforce, the very thin pink line going from PS on the left to OW on the right. But look at the same line for women, you see this is nearly half of women permanent salaried workers. In fact, what we find is that 57% of permanent salaried workers, women workers, were now out of the workforce. And this really says something, given that permanent salaried work is the supposedly most secure kind of employment arrangement. This is also the arrangement that saw the highest exit of women. But in general, across all employment categories, nearly half of the female workforce had withdrawn from employment entirely. So in the face of a massive economic shock like the lockdown and then the subsequent general contraction of the economy, what typically happens is that women are now pushed out of the labor market entirely, while men are able to negotiate labor market, moving into different kinds of fallback employment arrangements like daily wage work or self-employment. The other thing that we also saw, that even in terms of the industry of employment, women had far fewer options. So men would typically move into agriculture, construction or petty trade. But for women, the major sector that was absorbing women workforce from other sectors was agriculture. None of the other sectors played a significant role in absorbing women workers. So in terms of fallback employment options, this was pretty non-existent for women, and they typically just withdrew from the labor market entirely. Now, despite this massive exodus of women workers from the labor market, if you look at the women's workforce participation rate pre-pandemic, say in Jan 2020, and you look at it in December 2020, you find that the workforce participation rate is almost back. So it's almost at 80% of its Jan 2020 level in December 2020. So how do you reconcile the massive exodus of women workers with this restoration of the workforce participation rate? And then what we realized that this was the reason why this was happening is that there was a massive influx of female workers into the labor market as well. And here too, when you have this movement of women into the labor market as well, which is something which is seen to a far lesser extent for men, here too you find huge disparity between men and women in terms of what is the kind of employment arrangement that they enter into. So in this figure, this is essentially looking at the distribution of the employment type for those women who have entered afresh into the labor market. That is, they were not working in 2019 and they have now entered into the labor market. So it compares the distribution of employment arrangements for women with men. As you can see, for 43% of the newly entered women, it was daily wage work which was the major point of entry. For men, on the other hand, the major point of entry was self-employment. 54% of men who entered had now entered as self-employed workers. Now, on an average, a daily wage worker typically makes around 8,000 rupees per month, whereas a self-employed worker makes around 13,000 rupees per month. So when you look at the kind of work that women are entering into, you clearly see that not only is this more precarious, but it is also lower paid compared to the kinds of work that men enter into. So to sum up, what we find is that women are typically being pushed out of the labor market. In fact, when we did an econometric exercise, what we found was that women were 7 times more likely than men to lose work, and having lost work, they were 11 times more likely to not come back into employment at the end of the year. What we also find is that when women do enter into the labor market, they are entering into far more precarious and lower paid kinds of work. So what we see is what is clearly a disproportionate and an unfavorable impact for women in the labor market compared to men. But besides the impact on paid economic work, we also wanted to look at what has been the implication for women's unpaid work. For this, we use our insights from the India Working Survey. The India Working Survey is essentially a survey of 2 states, Karnataka and Rajasthan. This was originally a field survey conducted during the months of February and March, and then we went back and resurveyed these households through a phone survey in the month of September. During both of these surveys, we collected detailed information of men and women's allocation of time in different activities in the household. In the month of February and March, pre-pandemic, women, about 70 to 60% of women, both in Karnataka and Rajasthan, spent about 1 to 2 hours in cooking. A smaller share, between 10 to 20%, spent about 2 to 4 hours in cooking. But when we went back and resurveyed these women in the months of September, what we found was that now the share who spent between 2 to 4 hours cooking had increased to about 50 to 55%. So there was a massive increase in the time allocation for cooking, and this also was accompanied without any relief in the kind of paid work, in the hours of paid work that these women were doing. So for women who did remain employed, this has also come on top of an increase in household care work as well. So all in all, there has been a massive disproportionate impact for women, both in the realm of paid work as well as unpaid care work. So what are the major policy recommendations that emanate given the disproportionate impact on women in the labor market? One, to begin with, we call for a COVID hardship allowance of 5,000 rupees for a period of 6 months to Anganwadi and Asha workers, most of whom are typically women. Two, we also call for means of engaging women in the workforce while also addressing the immediate needs of the crisis through engaging them in the production of PPE kits as well as in community kitchens. In the medium term, we also call for an increased investment in social and public infrastructure, including in Anganwadis and primary healthcare centers. This can be a means to create the enabling and supportive infrastructure that can allow women to go out to engage in paid work, while also providing viable means of employment for these women themselves. In the more longer term as well as in the medium term, we also call for an urban employment guarantee scheme as well as a rural employment guarantee scheme expansion, which can cater specifically to the labor market demands of women. And in a longer term again, keeping in mind the national employment policy that is set to come out, we call for a very gender-specific addressing of concerns within the national employment policy, keeping in mind all of these massive disproportionate impacts that women in the labor market have faced as a result of the pandemic. For more information on these findings, please visit our website cse.azimpremjiuniversity.edu.in.